So for those of you who come in late, we have our three speakers. We have Dr. Alicia McDonough, Dr. Bill Farquhar, and Dr. Richard Wainford. And we've had some really great presentations today that tie in basic and translational and clinical science and what to do. So bring your questions forward.
Any old question. Doesn't have to relate to the topics that we talked about, right?
Well,
Yeah.
maybe a little, but...
Okay. Since the objective of this panel is to stimulate discussion, I'm just going to bring a different perspective. So I spent most of my career in academia. For those who don't know me, now I work for the pharmaceutical industry. And I think the very first issue that we have with salt sensitivity is the definition of it. Mm-hmm. Unless you guys can come up with a single unified definition of salt sensitivity, we're not going to go anywhere. Because you cannot define your patient population, you cannot design your clinical trials, and that's it.
Do you want to comment on that?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not uniform. I mean, I agree, it's not uniformly defined. I mean, in our lab, with our protocol and our levels of dietary sodium, we define it one way. Other methods, I mean, I mentioned briefly the Weinberger method.
Yes.
That's also a different definition in terms of how much blood pressure needs to change before you would call someone salt sensitive. So yeah, it's not at all uniform, I agree.
Do you have an opinion on which you prefer as a measure? Do you prefer a 10% change in blood pressure? Do you prefer an absolute change of 5 millimeters of mercury? Do you have a feeling of which you think is more reliable or consistent with the true phenotype?
Well, if you look at some of Weinberger's data that go back to the 1970s, he actually had like 3 categories: salt resistant, like an indeterminate middle area, and then salt sensitive. And while there is evidence that sodium sensitivity is reproducible, there's also also variability. But he had that kind of middle indeterminate type of area in terms of blood pressure changes. So I mean, I think what we do in our lab, we've been focusing on salt resistant just to get at the BP independent effects of sodium. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
So in Alicia's talk, she emphasized, I think I have this right, the interdependence of potassium and sodium in the distal nephron, and how potassium affects sodium excretion, how potassium acts as sort of a diuretic. However, to make things even more complex, there's another variable, which is acid-base. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the collecting duct as, sort of ion transport has to balance. If you have to secrete protons, then you end up, that affects the sodium reabsorption. So the acid ash or alkaline ash content of the diet could potentially have a big effect then on blood pressure.
And that's why the study that's going to come out of Netherlands will be valuable. So they're doing 3 groups, and they're doing potassium supplementation with KCl and also with potassium citrate, which will mimic a fruits and vegetable diet. So I think that's very important. I'd also like to say that salt sensitivity, there's classic studies done a million years ago in the doll rats showing high salt will raise blood pressure. And it's just like the Russians versus the Germans in my early slide. But if you just add some potassium to that high salt diet, the blood pressure goes back to normal. So salt sensitivity is very vaguely described. And it just has to come back to the ratio, I think.
Background diet's important.
And also the
Right. So in the
citrate.
context of recommendations, I think recommendations have to be considered with regard to other variables that exist, such as the characteristics of the diet. The other big one is exercise. And I learned this the hard way. I was trying to be healthy, really low salt intake, running repeat half miles in August. And that did not work. I needed more sodium than what would have been recommended. So the recommendations kind of have to be context dependent, but I think Richard made a good point. If you make it too complex, nobody's going to pay any attention to it. So what do you do?
Yeah, I do want to comment on some of the issues that you've raised. First of all, to keep in mind that in the DRI report, one of the things that was identified is where we don't have sufficient evidence. And the committee had agreed on a certain level of evidence to accept if it was going to move forward with a recommendation. So it's not that it's rejecting certain things. It's saying this may be important, but we don't have the evidence in the form that we need to make the recommendation. Hopefully that's a stimulation to research. And then a second point, I just want to make sure amongst my fellow speakers here that the DRI, the chronic disease risk reduction DRI, is really to think of in terms of less than 2,300. It's not a recommendation to 2,300, it's less than 2,300. And that's what's unique about having that CDRR, I think. And then just to a final point, you know, one place where many of these recommendations get integrated is with the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so the scientific committee has started its evaluation of the science that will result in a report to the Secretary of HHS and the Secretary of USDA, who then come up with the dietary guidelines, which are more food-based in their orientation. So it's that opportunity to start integrating across these recommendations to say, what does that look like in terms of what the American public should be consuming?
Hi, Chris Minson, Oregon. Really excellent presentations and good panel discussion so far. Hopefully I won't ruin that here. My question. I'm asking this for a friend, as far as all of you know. Let's say someone is getting ready to start a clinical trial, and the clinical trial, one of the primary outcome variables is looking at a reduction in primarily systolic blood pressure in people with elevated blood pressure or stage 1 hypertension based on the new AHA guidelines. And they're going to do an intervention that's going to have high sweat rates, so we'll say exercise and other interventions. And so they're looking at a lot of the vascular outcomes, Bill, that you mentioned, and as well as potentially some sympathetic outflow and other things. At the end of the day, a lot of people might say that if you have a profound reduction, let's say it's 10 millimeters of mercury reduction, they're going to say this is all driven by the kidney, right? But your study isn't going to be looking at the kidney and salt and other things. So the reality is, in this study, for my friend, they're not going to be able to get 7-day sodium urine collections. They're not going to be able to, they don't have a metabolic way to control all the intake. So as far as from that design standpoint, what would the panel or individuals recommend to help understand the reduction in blood pressure and to either account to some degree that it might be in that population sodium intake, sodium excretion, potassium levels, or should just be ignored and just gone with what you got? And it's an impossible question, perhaps, but...
Well, I'll just say real quickly, it's not that hard to get a spot urine. And while the Institute of Medicine panel didn't view that as very helpful, there are plenty of studies that see that is, especially if you correct for creatinine, can be very useful. And you can get, if you can get a couple of spot urines, you can get an idea of the relative amounts of sodium and potassium that people are eating. Would you agree to that?
I agree. I mean, I think it's an awful lot better than nothing. And I said that these aren't recommendations that the panel or myself believe. I was trying to point out the current flaws. It's clinically not possible to collect urine, I don't think, unless you're in a very controlled environment every day for 7 days to find these things. I think we have to do this.
In a prison, maybe.
In a prison, maybe, exactly. But we don't do that at the moment. But I think there is a trial pending through that group that's coming through.
In the Netherlands.
Yeah. And so I think you have to do the best with you can, take as many samples as you can, use the data you have. I definitely don't think it's something that you should ignore.
Right, yeah, the spot urines are in there. I just seemed to me that was not strongly recommended or urged. So maybe the morning spot urines could be something.
Definitely, I agree with that.
Right, any recommendation to look at the actual sweat rates and change in sweat rates over time? Any reason to look at that?
I don't.
So, sorry, I want to say
If you
sweat rate.
want
So it's just
to.
sodium or potassium concentrations in sweat. Potassium is very low.
I was just going to say, I think even in a trial like that, even if there, depending on the population, even if there are no changes in blood pressure, I think that it's important to look at other target organs and vascular function. And I think hypertension or blood pressure, I think, is incredibly important, but I don't think it's everything. And I do think there's a need to look at, the effects of sodium reduction, sodium restriction on, in, groups that consume a lot of sodium on, for example, vascular function. And then even if blood pressure doesn't change, it's important to document those other benefits, I would say.
Great, thank you.
Just a quick question. I can recall reviewing the sodium-potassium report, and I think one of the issues with things like spot urine or some of these other potential ways of looking is often there's too much variability in how people have done the methodology. And so one approach is to think about how do you start standardizing that methodology so that you know it is predictive. Basically coming up with validation studies so that it can be a useful marker.
Great, thank you.
John Osborne, Minnesota. This is a great idea, great panel, great talks. And I don't want to be a wet blanket here. So I study hypertension. I have my whole life, salt, all of that. I was with Alicia on this recent NIH panel to look at this problem. And I walked away discouraged because basically what I learned is people don't take the drugs they're supposed to take. Yeah. And if they did, they could lower their blood pressure. We talk about lifestyle modification, exercise, diet. To Richard's talk, it kind of comes down to how do you get people to do this? And it really gets into city planning, behavioral studies. I mean, this is a really hard problem. So I think we all agree that lowering salt's good. And we can talk about why it works or not, but that taking drugs, exercise, I don't know what to do really to try to make this happen because it's a really multi-layered. You have the food industry. I don't know how you're going to deal with them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and that's why.
Sponsoring it. Well, yeah. So
The salt lobbyists, right.
But that's why I brought it up at the end there,
Yeah.
particularly with and I wanted to highlight, and I don't know how many people in the room have seen the World Health Organization packet, because it touches, I only briefly scanned over it, and it literally lays out plans for how to bring this into schools and communities, and sort of bringing it into the natural part of your lifestyle, to be aware of it, and get the healthy part of the lifestyle. Like, I grew up in the UK. I walked to school every day. I rode my bike to work. I moved to America and I got fat and old, and then didn't like it because my son called me fat and old, so I went back to the gym. But it's
shamed you into it. That's the way
he
to do
did
it.
shame me.
Right.
I'll bring him around, he'll shame us all. But it is a really hard problem, and that's what I was trying to allude to. It's not just about the science, it's the public health part of it. It's getting the message out, it's communicating. There's a lot of mobile app stuff that maybe could be done with that. Sort of, we're old, it's sad to say it. We don't know how to communicate with the younger generation. They use Twit and all kinds of things that I don't know how to use. But they're going to be important in getting the message out. They won't listen to this here. We need to market better. We need to do other things. And we're not the people that I don't think should be doing that. It's a different skill set that I know I don't possess. My panelists may do, but I don't.
You do need something like, a Fitbit and somebody, oh no, I need to walk 10,000 steps, and now they can monitor. There needs to be some way to change behavior.
Agree.
That we are not really doing.
So I spent 28 years in the academic world believing firmly that science will will out. And then in 2004, I went to work for the Food and Drug Administration. I became a regulator, so to speak. And one of the lessons I learned is that science is necessary, but it is not sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And from a regulatory point of view, you need the legal infrastructure, the economic justification, and the political will to move something forward. And that political will piece is often what's missing and often controversial. Also, in that history of being involved with things like the dietary guidelines, I agree with you that we spend a lot of time on the science end of it, but then we have to start thinking about the behavioral piece of it. What is it that really will make a difference, and what is it that people will accept that there are a lot of people who, they look at that red symbol for sodium on a product and they say, it's not going to taste good. I don't think I'll buy that one. So, that's the kind of marketplace that we're competing in.
And I'll stop, but to the thing, recent clinical trials where patients are enrolled and told, we're going to take urine samples to make sure you're taking your drugs like you're supposed to, and they don't.
No, it's incredible.
So I'm basically, I don't know how we change that, but that's, to me, the biggest hurdle that we have to get over.
I agree.
Hello, I'm Shoroj from Dr. Binajo's lab.
Oh, excellent.
And yeah, you highlighted our study. Thank you for that. So for that study, like we did determine the metabolites with salt. But our study highlighted more for the downstream effect.
Yes.
So it's like people are like highlighting it as like exercise pill or something. So I'm saying like it's good that in one study it's highlighted for the, like, I think the right part is salt changing the metabolite, that part, and it's highlighted like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have like another 2 big studies coming for the animal, but not with the human, that's part.
Okay.
And I have one question is like, when you guys determine the like urinary sodium, urinary potassium, that part, do you guys think about the variation in the human genome? Like, did you guys take the sequencing, like GWAS wise and this stuff type?
I didn't.
Like when you define the salt sensitivity, it may be like different from each human to human. Like what determined to my like salt sensitivity, maybe not for another people.
That's
right?
the extra layer of complexity that we face.
And another thing is like to go for the people, like when I go to a fast food chain or restaurant, I see the calories. It's written in like big bold. And I count like, I will not take that because it's like 1,000 calories or something. Can you do something with the salt to determine like...
You can ask for the salt information.
So if I have to ask for that, like for example, like ask for the salt information, right? So that's like too much
I think
human
actually
interaction too.
in New York City, because they're normally the leaders in this kind of thing, I think in restaurants in New York City now there is salt being highlighted on the menus. And it's pretty clear. It's the same kind of thing that's right next to it. It's like, this is a healthy meal. You know, you've seen like the healthy heart stuff from the American Heart. I'm pretty sure in New York City it's doing that for salt right now. But that's a very specific intervention in one place.
I thought Philadelphia was doing that.
Philadelphia may be doing it too.
Yeah, I think what New York did is they started this project with working with the food industry. If you look at a product like bread, which as you point out is a major source of sodium, you see a range among acceptable bread products. So New York started with the idea of, given that range that exists, how do we start moving the food industry toward the lower end of that range? And I mean, consumers can do that themselves. You can look at tomato soup in the store and figure out which one's the lower sodium and select that. FDA has a similar project. It's voluntary, and the food industry has come to the table, but I don't know where we are in terms of how much reduction we've actually achieved or have the potential to achieve. But, it's an effort in different municipalities to get the sodium down.
And also, like, we are discussing about the salt effect and this. We know that, like, salt has effect on the microbiota too, right? So, for example, if I have initially a good kind of microbiota, maybe like the salt will not affect like that. So do you guys, in the future, do you guys think about this microbiota in the consideration or not?
That was kind of one of the things I was getting at maybe on the biomarkers.
Right.
I didn't have time to include it on the slide, but that again could be another potential biomarker. There's a profile of a salt sensitive or a salt resistant, and I think this is exploding in terms of what we could do with that. We don't know where it's going to end up. It could be exosomes, it could be microbiota, it could be a lipid profile, it could be multiple of those things coming together. I don't think we actually know yet which will be the most successful.
But one of the bottom lines is that since 2005, we're still having an epidemic of hypertension. So the basic scientists need to provide some guidance in this, in all of these areas, from GWAS to microbiota, to think about not just sodium.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, very nice panel that we put together here. So maybe this is going to take it a little different, but interested in knowing about time of day of giving the sodium versus the potassium. So we've been involved in some of these different feeding studies, just with rats and mice, but profound differences in blood pressure can be had with just changing that up. And intermittent fasting now is all the rage. And so I don't know if you guys have thought about that in relation to how things could be controlled at different times and different feeding protocols.
Well, I think that it is key that, when you do these protocols, that it has to be done at the same time of day, definitely.
Yeah, but people
But in humans, I think there is a crisis, especially if you talk to Sean Stalker, about how do you even measure blood pressure, that nobody knows how to measure it right. So that comes down to it. Feet on the ground, arms, what time of day, how many minutes did you spend in the room before somebody measured the blood pressure? And I would say it's in that. Are we going to measure, what are we going to call? And you can address that, Bill. Is it first time in the morning blood pressure? It's highly variable with diet, with time of day, with all of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes.
And it gets to Romer's, it gets to Romer's question of how do you define salt-sensitive hypertension? We don't even know really how to, what was it, 2% of the medical students surveyed knew how to measure blood pressure right in the JAMA study, right? It's like nobody did it right, yeah.
So I'm going to say we'll take the two, but we are running over time, so, but we'll take the two that are waiting.
Well, then I'll be brief. I think everybody has alluded to what I was going to ask or say. I think there's a scientific question, and I think that one, as hard as it might be, might actually be the easier one. The implementation is horrible, and as you said, and you just pointed out, medical students and physicians, well, the physicians don't do the blood pressures. Their staff do the blood pressures. And it's really bad when my patients come to me and say, your staff doesn't know how to do my blood pressure, because my patient was taught by me how to do their blood pressure, because I've watched them and I had them demonstrate it to me. What you need to do, one of the things for the behavioral modification, I think we need to start to get physicians to make it seem that it is, not seem, but be important for them, that the patient knows. I go back to my very old doctors that taught me, okay, and I'm old now, so they were very old, but that you can use yourself as a physician to be therapeutic. And if you tell your patient and they know that it's important to you, they may more likely do it. If you know, and that's a reinforcement. You get their children, because the children will embarrass them to heck about it. And we've done that in Detroit, where it was more about sugar, and then they would tell their parents, you can't do that, because that's bad for you. And so you start early, you make it know that it's important. The patients that I have that are, they send me their blood pressures and spreadsheets every Monday morning that they've checked for the rest of the week. They know I care to know. And I'd venture how many people here were asked by their physician whether they salted their food.
Yeah, no.
Just think about it. Have you been asked that? I bet you haven't. If you do no added salt alone, it will help. And one last comment about prisons. Probably I'm the only person here who's worked in one as a physician, and I would caution you about removing any kind of dietary reward in prisoners, because they may, I removed a Snickers bar from somebody and he flooded the whole cell block.
Okay, I'm the last one. So I'm helping Ma from Emory. So my life is working on absolute sodium channels. So I think the education about how to reduce the sodium in the diet. I think we should focus on a child because I was invited by a high school. So my talk is about how bad sodium is in the food. So it was well received by the students. So I think we are getting old and we are stubborn. So I'm still eating a lot of salt in my diet too. So I think we should educate kids first. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Marie, I can't say her last name now, Latulip. Yeah, from ILSI for organizing this. I think she did a great job and kept us all on the same theme.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you to the speakers.